Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining WPMN's event today on Expedition Medicine. We have the pleasure of being joined by two members of the Adventure Medics team, who are the speakers for this evening, Dr. Tom Bettis and Dr. Kirsty Benton. Tom is a junior doctor who trained in the southeast of Scotland and is currently volunteering in Malawi with the United Nations, and Kirsty is an anesthetics trainee in the southwest who has worked on expeditions in Southeast Asia, Europe, and South and Central America. As mentioned, they are a part of Adventure Medics, which is an award-winning free online magazine with readers all around the globe. The magazine is aimed at students and healthcare professionals who are interested in wilderness, expedition, and humanitarian medicine, which fits the scope of this talk perfectly. So without further ado, Doctors Tom Bettis and Kirsty Benton, everyone.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. So hi, as I said, I'm Tom. I'm a junior doctor. I've been graduated for about 3 years now. And we also got Kirsty here, who is an anaesthetist down south in Bristol. So I'm just going to share my screen and we'll get the talk going. Here we go. So can we see that okay?
All good.
Yep.
Lovely. Thank you very much. So tonight, what we're going to do, we can have a brief overview really of the idea of adventure medicine and also a little bit about expedition medicine. And to do that, we're going to sort of illustrate things by going through kind of our stories in this world of medicine. So firstly, who are we? So we're both doctors who have an interest in adventure medicine, and we've got varying experiences. But as already been said, we met both working for the Adventure Medic, which is a free not-for-profit website that tries to serve as a bit of a hub for all things adventure medicine and people interested in the area. So firstly, it's probably worth saying, what is adventure medicine? So it's not really a officially recognized specialty. It's more of an umbrella term that covers a variety of different sort of areas of medicine, including expedition work, events and wilderness work, as well as humanitarian aid. But there's quite a lot of overlap between these areas. So we like to use the term adventure medicine just to kind of cover them all together. And really, in short, to me, it basically means any kind of medicine that takes place out of the usual hospital or GP environment. And it's practiced by a range of different people from a range of different specialties. Thinking specifically about expedition work as well. So an expedition being a journey that's undertaken by a group of people with a particular purpose. And these often occur in dangerous or austere environments where there's potentially a high risk of illness and injury. So a doctor is often a really key member of these teams. And they provide a really kind of broad scope of environments in which medicine might be practiced. And that's really where it overlaps with the idea of wilderness medicine. And, you know, it poses quite a lot of challenges, and you often have to rely on your clinical skills rather than on the tests and technology that we might be used to having in hospital. So a brief bit about me to start. So I studied at the University of Edinburgh and graduated back in 2018 now. When I was a student, I spent most of my free time playing sports or running away to the mountains. And it was here that I first got a kind of flavor of adventure medicine and gained an interest in it. Because for me, it combined my interest in the mountains and the outdoors and travel with my degree. So, for example, the first time I really kind of got to apply this was after I did my intercalated degree. So I took a year out after second year to do sports science. And I combined this with an interest in extreme environments, where for my dissertation, I got a group of my friends who all happened to have asthma and got them to do some exercise testing in an environmental chamber that had chilled down to sub-zero temperatures, basically just trying to see what effect it would have on their lung function and try and induce some exercise-induced asthma, really. And then also one summer, I got to take part in an expedition to the Bolivian Andes. So we spent 8 days living at the top of a mountain at around 5,000 meters in an abandoned ski hut. And the aim of this was really researching the factors that might be contributing to acute mountain sickness or altitude sickness, which is a condition that's not really fully understood. And really, we were just trying our best whilst doing some exercise testing and having blood tests and things done to try and get altitude sick. Some of us more successfully than others. As you might imagine, living up at the top of a mountain like this for 8 days can be a bit challenging, not least when your hematology machine decides to break in transit and you literally are left with some skin glue and dental floss to try and repair it. Although admittedly, we didn't really succeed to doing that. And as well, it was a really good excuse to go visit South America. If you're flying there anyway, we all got time to spend more of Bolivia and also go see Peru. So then in final year, I got to do my general medicine placement up in Fort William in the Highlands of Scotland over winter. And this was brilliant. It was a really good distraction, all these snowy mountains, from studying for finals. And then after I finished my final exams, for those of you who don't know, who maybe aren't at med school, most medical schools, at least pre-COVID, will let you do an international elective placement. And I did mine in Nepal, where I was posted in a small rural hospital in a place called Mantali. It was called Tamakoshi Hospital. And it was here where I first really got the opportunity to see just how limited healthcare access can be in some parts of the world. We had people, presenting with all kinds of emergencies, things like strokes and sepsis, and they'd often made 5+ hour journeys, often on foot, just to reach the hospital. And then, if they were severely ill, there was then also another 4-hour drive by road to get to the capital city of Kathmandu to try and access intensive care. This hospital itself was a bit of a hub for the kind of local community, and it had really quite comprehensive services considering where it was. It had inpatient and outpatient departments, it had full X-ray, it had a full maternity monitoring unit, and was offering ultrasound to its patients. But resources were still quite limited. You can see me checking blood pressure the old-fashioned way in the bottom right-hand corner here, because we didn't have automated sphygmomanometers. And in the top right, you can see a couple of junior doctors who ran the outpatient clinic. Whilst there, I also got to go on a bit of an adventure to an even more remote health post, which was about a 45-minute walk from the main road, followed by about an 1.5-hour journey sitting in the back of a flatbed lorry filled with gravel and iron rebar to the top of this mountain path, basically. And there we were basically hosted by the local monk for a couple of days. And he ran this small outpost, which was people's only access to healthcare there. And even at the top of this small kind of mountain village, there was quite a lot of diagnoses to be made. So that was ranging from people who had sort of blocked infected ears right up to relatively rare sort of genetic conditions like neurofibromatosis. So where am I now? Well, after I finished university, I completed my foundation training in Southeast Scotland, and I followed that by a 6-month stint in A&E. And then in February of this year, I moved to Malawi, which is where I am just now. So for those of you who don't know, Malawi is this small country here down in the southeastern part of Africa. It's a completely landlocked nation, but it does have this large lake here, which is Lake Malawi. It's Africa's third largest, I believe. And Malawi is one of the world's most or least developed worlds, and it's got a predominantly rural population of about 19 million people. But for that population, per 100,000, we've only got 3.6 doctors here, which is a tiny number. And to put that into perspective, in the UK, we've got about 580 doctors per 100,000 people, so significantly more. And one of the reasons for this is there's a kind of legacy of what some people call the brain drain, where Malawian trained doctors were moving overseas to Europe and America and places where really they had better earning potential. And so the policy here was to try and reduce the number of doctors they were training because they were worried they were all just leaving, and instead train up what are called clinical officers. And we don't really have an equivalent for these in the UK. But really what they do is fill the doctor's role, but they have more limited training. They're actually usually very excellent at what they do, especially for certain conditions that they see frequently, things like malaria. They're very, very good at managing. But you can see how all of these factors together can make delivering healthcare here pretty challenging. And for me, myself, I've been doing a real mix of things here, a lot of which are not really probably covered in your standard medical school curriculum. But that's one of the benefits of coming and doing something like this, as well as the challenges. You get a really wide range of experience. It takes you out of your comfort zone, and you might often see unfamiliar conditions, things that might be non-existent back home, particularly in the area of infectious disease. But another opportunity that comes with that is the ability to exchange learning with the healthcare workers here. So like I mentioned, things like HIV and malaria are the bread and butter of the clinicians here in Malawi. They're really used to managing those, but they may be relatively more specialist back in the UK. But here, sort of acute and emergency care is not so well developed. So that's where I've got a bit more experience, and it gives us an opportunity to learn from each other, which is really sort of useful and productive, I think. So the predominant amount of work I've been doing here has been volunteering with the UN as part of their COVID response. On the less exciting end of things, that's involved doing audit and report work on the treatment center they have here. So at the start of the pandemic, the UN decided they were going to adhere to this principle of stay and deliver. They've got a lot of development projects going on here, and over 900 staff who are playing a vital role in those, and they can't just all up and leave. So the UN committed to setting up a COVID-specific treatment center with the aim of being able to offer really quite high quality healthcare here and try and keep their staff safe as possible for both the national and the international staff here, because healthcare can be sometimes pretty hard to access. And then in March of this year, when vaccines became available in Malawi, I kind of got roped in and recruited into helping supervise and set up the UN's COVID vaccine program here, where we adapted the treatment center for use as a clinic. And since then, we've delivered about 4,000 doses, including to a few kind of VIP clients, which one of which was the Malawian Olympic team before they went off to Tokyo, which was pretty cool. 4,000 doses might sound not very many compared to the UK, where we're measuring things in a matter of millions, but actually even achieving that was pretty challenging. You've probably heard a lot of the kind of conspiracy theories back home, and things like that vaccines might kill you or cause infertility. But here there are also some that on the face of it might sound a little bit more far-fetched, such as the idea that the vaccine might turn people into a chimpanzee. And, you know, that seems far-fetched, as I said, and it might seem like something you could easily make light of. But actually, in a country like this, where access to the internet and unbiased news is pretty limited, and people's education is also limited, it's really not really that surprising. So, for example, people have WhatsApp here. The country basically runs on it, but they often can't afford to buy full data bundles. So instead, they'll buy a WhatsApp-specific bundle that allows them to send and receive messages. So that's how they get this information, but they have then no way of surfing the internet and verifying or fact-checking any of the things they're told. And this all plays in as well with the fact that there's a not entirely unjustified distrust of the West and also of its medicine, given the kind of legacy that colonialism has here. And sadly, there's been a bit of a misconception that COVID itself and now the vaccines are a part of a kind of Western conspiracy to depopulate Africa. So, you know, for me, it's been really important to try and approach these issues quite delicately. So whilst we've been running a vaccine clinic, obviously you're keeping an eye out for things like anaphylaxis and side effects, but actually the bulk of the work has been on education, not just for patients, but for staff as well. And at the treatment center where I've been, the staff have been excellent, and they've had really good high quality teaching from the World Health Organization before we started giving the vaccines. But believe it or not, I've seen some clinics where there'll be somebody there happily jabbing everyone away who comes here, but they refuse to get the vaccine themselves. And I think that goes a long way to kind of just demonstrate how deep-seated the problem is here with this sort of thing, and explains partly why Malawi's vaccination rate is only 2.5%, despite relatively widespread access to vaccines here now. On the more exciting end of the spectrum, I've been able to be involved with medical evacuations of patients from the treatment center. As I said, high quality care here is often quite limited, and intensive care is almost non-existent. Even getting access to something like oxygen can be a challenge. And there's been times during the pandemic where people have died simply because there wasn't enough access to oxygen rather than because their disease process was so severe. Back in the UK, I'd be used to just, you know, every bed in the hospital being able to plug in a mask and turning on as much oxygen as I wanted. But here I could probably count on one hand how many facilities have access to a piped oxygen plant. So a solution to that people use is oxygen concentrators, which are these devices about the size of a mini fridge that will produce oxygen on demand. But unfortunately, it's often at relatively low flow rates, and often they're power dependent as well. So these things need mains supplies. And in a country where there's relatively frequent power cuts, particularly in rainy season, which is approaching again, there's often a bit challenging. So often we end up relying on oxygen cylinders instead, which are really great. You can deliver high flow rates with them, but they also run out quite quickly. So the big cylinders we have here are about 7,000 litres of oxygen, which sounds like a lot on the face of it, but when you've got patients running at maybe 15 or even 20 litres per minute, it's going to run out in a matter of hours. And if you've got a ward full of patients, you can see how quite quickly we end up in a bit of a battle to constantly replace the empty cylinders with full ones. And that's then compounded by the fact that roads are relatively poor here. And it's not that uncommon to see lorries, big articulated lorries, abandoned by the side of, or sometimes in the middle of the road with axles hanging off and wheels hanging off. And so it's only a matter of time before deliveries get missed and then patients start to suffer. So for those patients who are too sick to be managed on the wards, we need to fly them out of the country, which is a process that requires quite a bit of logistics and planning. Once we make the call to evacuate a patient, a plane gets mobilized from Nairobi in Kenya. And then we've got a few hours to get the patient ready into the back of an ambulance and then on the way to the airport, bearing in mind that this is usually taking place in full PPE in the middle of African heat. The journey itself to the airport is pretty hairy. Ambulances here are not really what we think of as ambulances back home. They're usually beaten up old Toyota Land Cruisers that somebody's stripped the back out of and shoved a stretcher in and maybe an oxygen cylinder as well. And then the drivers hammer them along these roads, weaving in and out of traffic. And really, it feels genuinely like the patient's more likely to die in a road traffic accident than they are of their COVID. But thankfully, that hasn't happened. And then we have the surreal experience of driving straight onto the runway, which is pretty cool, and where we hand over to the ITU team from Nairobi. But before they can get into the plane, we have to seal them in this device here you can see on the top left, which rather unfortunately looks a bit like a coffin. And we did actually have some patients who the plane had landed, they made it all to the way to the airport and then refused to get in it because of that. So that's just another problem we had to face. But what it is, it's a device that allows you to seal the patient in, protecting the team from any infection risk, but while still being able to deliver full medical care and medical monitoring, which is a really good solution for the team, but maybe not so much for patients. I personally can't imagine having to sit, this sort of claustrophobic misery of lying flat on your back in that for 2 or 3 hours in the back of a kind of small aeroplane. But these are some of the things that you have to try and overcome in a relatively resource poor environment. Alongside this kind of UN work, I've also had the opportunity to do some clinical teaching, which partly has been for the treatment center, looking at the kind of basics of acute care with A2E assessments, anaphylaxis, shock, this sort of thing. But also on the behalf of the World Health Organization with a consultant who's come from Nigeria. And most of that was looking at the management of COVID specifically and trying to kind of bolster Malawi's COVID response for any future waves that come here. And then hopefully soon I'll also be starting at one of the central hospitals here, so Community Central, which is the main government hospital in the capital of Lilongwe here. So that's quite a whistle-stop tour of quite a few things that I've been doing, and you might be wondering what's the point of all that. I think for me it was really just to show the variety of possibilities that are open to you with a medical degree, if you're adaptable, flexible, and keep an open mind. Speaking of which, I've also had the opportunity to moonlight a little bit. So there's a local wildlife trust here where my partner is the veterinarian, and they've been really short of volunteers because of the COVID pandemic. So I had kind of had my arm twisted and was roped into helping out. I don't personally have any animal experience, but there's quite a lot of transferable skills that you have as a doctor. And so I was able to help out doing health checks on the baboons, taking blood from them, and even helping look after some of the 200 other animals they have at the center. Which is probably not your typical doctor's experience when they go away, but it's just, again, to show you the kind of things that might open up for you. So last but not least as well, it's also just given me the opportunity to explore and see this really beautiful country that is Malawi, particularly in a time where travel whilst it's opening up, has been more limited. It's been a really kind of privileged experience to be able to go and see some of these things. So I'm going to take an opportunity to shut up a little bit now, and I'm going to hand over to Kirsty, who's going to talk a little bit more detail about some of the amazing expedition work that she's done. So Kirsty, I'm just going to stop sharing and I'll hand over to you.
Okay, so I'm going to just change to sharing my screen now. Hopefully that works. Tom, give me some feedback. Is that all okay?
Yeah, I can see it.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm just going to talk a little bit from where Tom left off in his life as an adventure medic. So I'm, just to recap, I'm an anaesthetic trainee in the Southwest. I've got a background in global health, and I've been working in expedition medicine for the last 4 years. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a day in the life of an expedition medic. Full disclosure, it's going to be all pre-COVID because I've not been as lucky as Tom, and my life as an expedition medic has been significantly less interesting in the last 18 months. All my trips have been cancelled. So I'm going to take you back to 2019, where I had finished my foundation years. So I'd finished my first 2 years of training as a doctor. And I decided to not go into specialty training, and instead I was going to take a little bit of time out of training and explore this world of expedition medicine and see if I could make a career of it. I didn't know anything about it, but I did see that there was a clinical fellow job advertised where it would be an emergency medicine and an expedition medicine clinical fellow, and it was the Bristol Royal Infirmary. So I was lucky enough to get that job, And what it meant was spending 75% of my time in the emergency department, and 25% of my time was for expedition medicine. Now, knowing the NHS, I thought this was definitely too good to be true, but it turned out to be exactly what it said on the tin. And with my 25% of my time, I managed to do 2 training courses, so one in wilderness medicine and one in winter mountain medicine. And I managed to get trips as the medic to Mexico, China, Italy, and Costa Rica. So a pretty busy year. So the reality check is that 75% of my time was in an inner city emergency department, and all the challenges that come with that, I'm sure you can imagine if you haven't done that job yet. As Tom mentioned, expedition medicine isn't a recognized specialty. So people often do these expedition trips alongside their main specialty. So for example, working as an anaesthetist, when my trips are able to happen again, I'll be doing the expeditions in my study leave time or in my annual leave time. The other option is to do exactly what Tom's doing, or what I was doing as a clinical fellow, is and take some time out of training, and then you have a lot more flexibility and ability to say yes to some of the longer trips. So the training courses that I did that year were brilliant. I did a wilderness medical training course in the Atlas Mountains in Morocco, and I did a winter mountain medicine training course. It was sort of a gentle introduction into what would be expected of me as an expedition medic. Some useful things like how to plan for expeditions, things like thinking about what group you're taking on the trip, so what the demographic is, what the age is, thinking about what environment you're going to be in and what common problems might arise. The Moroccan trip was a really unique experience. We took 7 days to climb, hike up and summit Mount Toubkal, which is 4,200 meters. So that was my first exposure to altitude, and it was a good way to check how my body reacts to that environment. And along the way we learned about navigation, we learned practical skills about how to splint a broken leg, for example, with the equipment you have around you. So using a walking poles, for example. So a lot of really useful and fun stuff to learn. The winter mountain medicine course was awesome, mostly because I got to take it as study leave and I got to ski every day, which was great. And the evenings were for all the academic work. So that's when we had the tutorials, and it was a lot of the stuff I learned on the Moroccan trip, but a bit more of a focus on altitude sickness, hypothermia, frostbite, and we also got to learn some cool skills like ice climbing. So after I'd done those trips, I felt like I was in a good position to be able to apply for jobs as an expedition medic. Felt like I had some qualification behind me. So the trips I did that year, as I mentioned, took a research group out to Mexico. I was with them in the jungle and then the coast. Then I did some charity trips, a cycle from Milan to Venice, a trek on the Great Wall of China, and the epic journey from the East Coast to the West Coast, cycling in Costa Rica. So I thought what I'd do would talk a little bit about a day in the life of an expedition medic on one of my trips. So I'm going to talk about the jungle and dive research trip to Mexico. To give you some background information, the group were 30 uni students, and they were collecting data for their wildlife and conservation masters. There were also 8 staff members, so that included the university lecturers, the expedition leadership team. There was myself, the medic, and we had our local guides as well. So it was quite a diverse group, wide age range, different ethnicities. So before I went, I had in my mind what I might be expecting. I particularly was worried about what I might be expecting, thinking about being in Mexico for weeks on end with 30 uni students all living on top of each other. But they were actually a lot better behaved than I expected them to be. So that was lucky. The location was the jungle and then the coast. The coast I wasn't so worried about. I had a look at where we were, and we were quite close to some big tourist hotspots. And I could see that there were hospitals with some really good facilities only about 20 minutes away from where we were. The jungle gave me a little bit more to worry about, in that even when we were at base camp, we were an hour from hospital by car. So that was something to bear in mind. I had a look and made note of some what facilities were available in that hospital. And then I was a little bit worried when I saw how much further we'd have to travel for some more specialist care, but luckily I didn't need any of that on the trip. The environment, so I knew there was going to be a lot of challenges in that environment. It was hot, really, really hot, and it was very dry. We didn't have any access to water where we were, so we had to have water brought into the camp, which did mean I didn't have to worry about the cleanliness of the water and people getting ill from it, which was good. But I did always have a slight worry at the back of my mind what would happen if we did run out of water and somehow the supply didn't get there one day. Other challenges in the environment were that base camp was quite a small square footage. There was a lot of us there all living on top of each other, and there weren't the normal sort of coping mechanisms of stress for the students to deal with. So we didn't have access to internet, there was no phone signal, so they weren't able to contact home. And it was quite a challenging environment for them to be in. So that did throw up some problems. Other environmental challenges were the animals. I was notified before I went out that there were 3 types of venomous snakes who happened to be living in the jungle that we were in. So I made sure I knew what they looked like before I went out. And I also knew that the groups were going to be working with bats. They were going to be doing research with bats. So making sure that everyone had their rabies jabs before we went was really important. Also, when we got there, I found out that some of the groups were looking at the tracks of big cats in the region, and that there happened to be a jaguar we were living in its territory. So all those things, even though there was a very small chance of any of that going wrong, of any of that happening, if they did go wrong, I felt like those would be fairly catastrophic events. And medical kit, that's always something to think about before you get medical kits, which is good, because otherwise it would be expensive. And if you, it's really important to try and get hold of a list of what's in that medical kit before you go out. Luckily with this trip, I was really happy with the medical kit. It seemed to be really extensive until I got there, and I opened up the medical kit to have a look through everything and found out that our EpiPens were out of date. And we didn't have a huge number of antibiotics, so there was only 1 course of antibiotics for each type. So if 2 people got ill with the same infection, I was going to have to pick who got that course of antibiotics, which I wasn't particularly pleased about. So all just issues to think about, things that just don't arise in the hospital environment, so quite unique to the expedition scenario. So I'll talk you through a day in the jungle. So I'd be woken up by heat, really, really boiling hot heat. My tent would quickly become a totally hostile environment that I'd have to escape out of very quickly. But that was no bad thing, because it meant that I would get to breakfast early and get a good spot to do what I call the breakfast review. So as an expedition medic, even though your main role is obviously treating any of the issues that arise, one of the best things you can do as an expedition medic is try and foresee and prevent any medical issues that might happen. So breakfast, I think, is a really good opportunity to try and intervene in any situation that you think might arise later on in the day, might get worse. So it's a good opportunity to have a look at who's having breakfast, whether they look a little bit peaky, whether maybe they haven't slept very well, make sure they fill up their water bottles with enough water for the day. It's a good chance to have a look around and see who hasn't emerged out of their tent, and maybe have a wander around, check in on them, and make sure they're going to have something to eat before they go out in the day. The medic radio is the next responsibility. So making sure that you're able to be communicated with is critically important as the medic on these trips. So it sounds very simple, but making sure the radio is charged on your person and switched on is really important, and I didn't always get right. So I'd have that on me at all times to make sure that people could contact me. Then you want to pack your day medical kit. So obviously the ideal situation, you'd love to be able to bring all your kit with you and have everything to hand if anything goes wrong when you're away from base camp. That's not possible because it's just you who's going to be carrying it, and you're hiking out in the heat all day. So you need to be really careful about what you pick to bring with you. So I'd often tinker with what was in my medical kit every day, and my day medical kit definitely changes depending on what kind of expedition I'm on. But for this trip, the main things I bought really were painkillers, things to strap up any ankles that people went over, dressings, disinfectant, antihistamines. Those were all the normal things. And then I always would think about what I would want with me if there was any sort of catastrophic issue that happened, any sort of trauma, someone fell and had any major injuries. But you do have to bear in mind you cannot bring everything with you. because you'll also be carrying things like water, sun cream, insect repellent, waterproof in case the weather changes. And you're not only bringing enough for yourself, but one thing that you'll definitely learn on these trips, if you do them, is that no matter how much you tell people to bring enough water with them, to bring sun cream, to bring a hat, there will always be people who don't bring enough. So you'll save them and yourself a lot of problems if you bring extra. So on a good day, I would get to go out and do an activity with one of the research groups. So some of the best days were sat on the jungle floor, looking up and watching the howler monkeys and the spider monkeys while the teams were all collecting data on them. The harder days were the days where I was, where I had to stay behind at base camp. So that would be the days where someone was a little bit unwell, a bit under the weather, maybe a bit dehydrated. And that picture in the top right corner is my clinic room. So the hammock and the mosquito net is where I'd keep anyone who I particularly wanted to keep a close eye on. But often it would just be a case of making sure they had fluids or rehydration tablets, had some rest in their tent, and then they'd be absolutely fine the next day. When everyone was back from their activities and their research, I'd always make sure I had an hour for clinic. So I do this on every trip. Often, depending on your expedition, you may have to get to certain checkpoints at a certain time. So if you've got people coming up to you with non-urgent issues every 5 minutes, you may hold up the rest of the team and jeopardize the progress of that expedition. So it's a really good point to have an hour for clinic in the evening, where you just sit and let people approach you with anything that's non-urgent. It's a really efficient way to deal with any medical issues. So the main issues I would see would be insect bites, infected wounds, minor injuries, mental health issues. So as I said, there weren't a lot of the normal coping strategies for people to use in that environment. So whether it was a flare of a chronic issue like anorexia or a new anxiety or low mood, that was a vast proportion of the issues that I dealt with on the trip. There was some diarrhea and vomiting. There was an awful lot of constipation, rashes. I was constantly being shown various body parts of people and being asked, what's this rash and what do I do? Heat illness and dehydration were the main things. Then it would be time for supper, relax, another little review of people just before they went to bed. And then it'd be time for bed, but bearing in mind that as the expedition medic, you are on call 24/7. So the whole time on the trip, you are never switched off as a doctor. That always has to be at the forefront of your mind. And people will wake you up in the middle of the night, and they'll wake you up even if it is just to tell you that they have stubbed their toe on the way back from the bathroom. That definitely did happen on this trip. So the biggest challenges, I think the biggest challenge is diagnosis. So as Tom mentioned, you don't have all the scans that you need at your fingertips. You can't do all the blood tests that you would want. And so you're totally reliant on your clinical skills, which actually the majority of the time is fine. But where that does become a problem is when you're trying to decide how to manage that ambiguity or that uncertainty. So in my mind, you can be overcautious or you can be undercautious. Now, in hospital, we'd never be undercautious. We'd always send the extra blood tests. We'd always do the extra scan to make sure that we've got our diagnosis right and that we're not missing something more serious. However, it's different in the expedition environment, because to do that, you'd need to remove that individual from the expedition and take them to the hospital. So that's ending the trip for that person. That's potentially stopping the trip for the rest of the participants. So they may not be able to carry on the rest of that day if you're the only medic. They may not be able to, and if they don't get to a certain point by that day, they may have to end the whole expedition. So even though your patient is always your main priority, you do have to think about making sensible decisions in that environment, which is really unique and not like how you would practice in the hospital. But probably the main things are thinking about the physiological impact of some of the extreme environments that you might be in. So from altitude to heat illness, frostbite, hypothermia, you have to really think about preventing all of those things as much as you can on the trips, because if you get to a situation where you're trying to treat them, it's a lot trickier. Communication issues like language barriers for something as simple as just trying to find out whether there's any allergens in a meal, or thinking about the fact that sometimes you might not be able to contact any clinical decisions unsupported. which feels very different because obviously in a hospital environment, you would phone a specialist registrar, or you may phone your consultant to get advice. So it can feel quite isolating and like a big weight on your shoulders when you're making those decisions on your own. So saying that big weight on your shoulders leads me on to talking about your own health and your well-being. This is definitely something that I underestimated before I went out on my first trip. You have to make sure that you're physically fit enough for the expedition. So you'll be doing the challenge alongside those participants. So you will be cycling in the 40-degree heat up a volcano, and expelling a lot of energy, trying to motivate the rest of the team to be able to achieve their goals. And on top of that, you've got to make sure you have enough brain space to make sure that you're making good clinical decisions at all times. So that's something I had definitely underestimated before my first trip, but I don't underestimate now. Other challenges, being far from help. So this is the Great Wall of China. And on my first day on a trip there, I walked up one of these massive hills and heard one of the participants screaming for help from the doctor. So I ran over, and her friend, one of the other members of our group, was choking. Now, clinically, I know how to deal with choking. It's unpleasant, but it just is alternating between back slaps and high neck maneuvers. So I carried on doing that for an uncomfortably long time, and the choking hadn't stopped. So I thought in my head, where's this going to go? What's the worst case scenario? I thought, worst case scenario, she's starved of oxygen, she becomes hypoxic and has a cardiac arrest, so her heart stops. I thought, that's fine, I can do CPR. And then I had a moment of thinking about all the beautiful scenery that we'd seen that day and exactly where we were, and wondering how on earth anyone was going to get us out of that environment once I started CPR. So we were not accessible by road, and as you can see, it's not exactly an easy point for a helicopter to land. So luckily, the nut that she was eating dislodged and she stopped choking. She was fine, traumatized, but fine. But it just was a scenario that really made me think about just how remote we were and the risk that you're putting yourself and the participants in when you're in those remote environments. Another big challenge that I hadn't foreseen before I started working in expedition medicine was politics. And I guess what I mean by that is just managing a multitude of different people's expectations. So to give you an example, this was a trip I did where unfortunately one of our participants came off her bike and went over the handlebars and suffered a really severe head injury. Now, clinically, we were able to deal with that pretty effectively on the ground. Luckily, there were 3 of us doctors in the group, and so the patient was stabilized quickly. We were easily accessible to ambulance, and as you can see in the top left corner, an air ambulance was able to land, stabilize her, and take her to a trauma center, accompanied by one of our other medics. So that was all fine. The part that I hadn't expected to be so tricky was then thinking about what impact that would have when we were one doctor down. So we had a group of roughly 100 cyclists. So we were now managing the group with just 2 medics, and we had to have a serious conversation about how we were going to continue and whether we could continue the rest of the trip safely, because there was a potential that something like this could happen again. We decided we could do it safely, and we would just have to rearrange a few of the logistics, but that was fine. We decided to continue. Another big difference that I found between working in the hospital and working in the expedition environment was then that I had 100 people who were asking me all day, every day, how the other participant was. Now, in hospital, if you've got someone who phones and they want information about a patient and you don't have their consent to give information, you can have a vague, fairly awkward conversation for about 10 minutes where you give some information, but you don't breach any patient confidentiality. And that's awkward, but it's only a 10-minute conversation, and then you can hang up the phone. And how uncomfortable it was to have people asking all day, every day, how she was. And you feel like you're letting them down by not giving them the information that they want. But obviously your main priority is not breaching any patient confidentiality, but that is psychologically quite tricky. And I was worried it would break some of the trust as a doctor and participant in that doctor-participant relationship. And finally, with these critical incidents, which by the way are extremely rare, but when they do happen, you may have a critical incident management company that gets involved. And they will normally phone from, for example, the US or the UK, and they will have their expectations of how they would like the incident managed. Some of that is to do with media coverage and how the information is portrayed in the media and what they would like, how they would like the group to proceed. And what's challenging is that sometimes their expectations and their goals aren't in line with what you think are the clinical priorities being on the ground. So on to the best bits. So the best bits by far are getting participants to achieve their goals. And a lot of them have overcome huge physical, emotional, financial challenges to get to this point. So being able to support them crossing the finish line is definitely the best bit of the job. Then the other people that you get to work with, so whether it's the other medics, the local guides, the expedition management team, I've been really lucky and got to work with a great group of people on every trip that I've been on. Teaching, so this is my classroom now. This is where I get to teach medical students and doctors with an interest in expedition medicine and lay people. And in my opinion, teaching in the Lake District or the Brecon Beacons is much more exciting than being in a conference centre in a city somewhere. So I always feel very lucky that I get to have these opportunities to teach in the outdoors. Learning, so as Tom said, you get exposed to so many other things when you're on these trips. So whether it's just learning about the animals on the research group, or doing yoga on the Great Wall of China over it, combat, whatever it is, you get to learn so many things on these trips, which is such an added bonus. And then finally, you get to see the world, which is a great aspect of the job. And often you get to do that for free, which is really great. So I'm just going to finish off by talking a little bit about how to get into expedition medicine, just to give some friendly advice. And then I'll hand over to Tom just to summarize. So Tom and I were both really keen to make sure you all know that it's about forging your own path. So there is no prescriptive way of getting into expedition medicine. Everybody has done it differently. There are a few things that I would say would help. So spend time outdoors, to just taking your friends camping for a long weekend. Spending time outdoors is a really good way to know what your body's able to manage on those trips, and also to know what to expect from other people's bodies in those environments. Join university societies. There's lots of wilderness societies now, and pre-hospital societies are also really useful. They're a good introduction into what medicine outside of the hospital environment is like. I would pick foundation jobs that give you relevant experience. If you can, in my opinion, GP and A&E are the best ones, in that they're the most likely things that you're going to see on expedition. So they give you a really good foundation into what you might be managing on an expedition. Take time out of training. You'll never regret it. Trust me, when you're in specialty training, it is so hard to get time off, and it really is heartbreaking to have to say no to a 6-week trip across the Atlantic. It is so important you take time out of training. Don't be scared to step off the treadmill. That is where all the exciting things happen. Education, there's lots of postgraduate qualifications you can do now in wilderness medicine. Attend conferences, do exactly what you're doing now, and listen to talks on expedition medicine. That's a really good start. Do the training courses. There are lots of them. They are highly recommended. And when you're thinking about applying for jobs as an expedition medic, think broadly. So there are always school trips that are looking for medics to accompany their students. Charity trips like the ones that I've done, the cycle and the trek. Think about getting experience in events. So whether it's music events or sports events, even in the UK, that's a really good experience. And then research and media trips are always looking for expedition medics, and often they're the ones that are slightly better paid as well. So I'll just hand you back to Tom.
Thanks, Kirsty. So that was brilliant. Thanks very much. So we're kind of coming to the end here, I think. I hope you found it interesting and have something you can take away from it. But I'll probably just leave you with a couple of thoughts and reiterate really what Kirsty said at the end there, which is that being a doctor can be much more than just being a GP or a hospital consultant. You know, for example, I came to Malawi with the sort of finished outline of a plan before coming here, but the fact that I'm a doctor meant that people really welcomed me with open arms, and I found lots of different ways in which I could help and be useful. So, whatever you end up doing in your life, whether that's being a doctor or otherwise, you don't have to get stuck on the rails, and you don't have to follow what everyone else does. Like Kirsty said, you're free to forge your own path. And so I think that's the thing that we'd like you to take away from this, really, if possible. So other than that, I'll just say thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. And just to remember that adventure is out there.
Thank you so much for that amazing talk, both of you. I'm sure if we were like in person, there would be a round of applause going around. Obviously, with it all being virtual, it's a bit different, isn't it? So whilst the audience types out any questions that they may have, I'm going to use this as an opportunity to try and plug WPMN, who are hosting this tonight. So well, I'm sure we're all aware of some of the challenges individuals from certain backgrounds go through when applying to medical school. But what is a little less known is that these sorts of disadvantages still do persist even after you get into medical school. So students and medical professionals from disadvantaged backgrounds are less likely to get into research, to complete further degrees, and are also poorly represented in more competitive specialties and are less involved in things like research, etc. So WPMN essentially exists to break down the barriers that have been put in place by forming a supportive community of individuals where we network and hold events, such as this one, advocate for students and doctors, and research key issues to try and drive change. We strongly encourage you all to join by visiting our website and getting involved. So I think hopefully we'll have some, if anyone's got any questions, please feel free to pop in the chat. There is one by Kate Brennan. I'm not sure if you guys can see it.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah.
So she's asked, it seems as though expedition and adventure medicine is quite inaccessible, e.g. wilderness and expedition medicine courses cost hundreds of pounds, and trips seem to cost lots to volunteer as a medic, e.g. rally and floating doctors, which is crazy as you also lose out on income. Any advice or perspectives on this? Kirsty, do you want to take that one?
Yeah. So I feel really strongly about this. I totally agree that that's how it appears, and it can be like that for a lot of expedition trips. And I think it is, I don't think you need to be spending a lot of money to become an expedition medic. So for example, if I use the job that I was talking about as the clinical fellow, so I got study budget with that in order to do one of the training courses. So I got a huge contribution towards that. Also, because I was doing the clinical fellow job, I was able to get the Chamonix trip for free because I came as a delegate, as a faculty, as part of the team. In reality, all I really did was serve teas and coffees, but it did mean that I was able to go on the trip for free. With all the expeditions that I did that year, because I was given 25% of my time, where I didn't have to be an A&E, but instead I could be on those trips, I was still technically being paid to be in the emergency department whilst standing on the Great Wall of China. So it can be expensive, and I agree that there are a lot of companies that do charge you to go out on those trips and be the medic, but that is certainly not how it has to be, and you just have to look for the other opportunities because they are out there. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks for that, Kirsty. Yeah, so Kate has popped in saying thank you. So we've also got a message from one of the societies at Imperial, Friends of MSF, and I was wondering if they could have the contact details for you. So would you be happy to pass on the contact details?
Yeah, absolutely. We can, I don't know if you want us to put them in the chat, or whether we can give you our Adventure Medic email addresses. We can send them to you as well, if that's easier.
I'm more than happy to get in touch and also forward it on.
Right,
so we've had another question from Esme. So she's in her final year of medicine and able to take an elective abroad, and would like to do something relevant and close to expedition medicine, but a lot of the electives out there are expensive. Also, she's worried about exploitation of communities and generally wondering what advice you would have on this.
Tom, would you like to take that?
Yeah, sure. So this is a really, really good point, and you're right that some of these things are expensive, and when you look online, often the first things you'll find are the big companies that are looking to make money out of you. So that is an option if you can afford it. But for example, what I did when I was in Nepal is So the one was organized through essentially a charity called Rural Access Nepal. And it did cost some money, but it was basically a kind of relatively nominal fee for accommodation and food whilst I was there. And all that money went directly into the hospital. So you paid it directly to the hospital director, which meant that there was no corporation like skimming off profits or anything. It was all going to help fund this rural hospital. So that's one way to try and do it. And it does end up being a little bit cheaper. Inevitably, going to these places with flights and things can be a bit pricey. Another thing to look for is often there are sort of grants or funds available for this sort of thing. So some student societies, some organizations will offer, sometimes it's in the region of hundreds of pounds to help try and fund your elective if you can justify it to them in some way why it's going to benefit you. So it's worth having a Google around and looking at those. It's also the worry about exploitation of local communities is also a very relevant and reasonable one to think about. I think my advice for that is just make sure you try and do your research about where you're going and whatever the organization is before you go, and try and see, is this an organization that I think people is sort of abiding by some decent ethical principles. Try and ask people who maybe have been with them before, look for sort of testimonials online. They can be quite enlightening. As a plug for Adventure Medic as well, we have a fairly extensive back catalogue of elective essays, so things that people have written about their trips to places. That's how I found out about my elective, and they can often be a good place to start and see how you go about contacting people. So that would be another place to try. I think that's probably what I would say on it. Do you have anything else to say, Kirsty?
No, I think that's all I would have said.
What else do we have here?
I'm happy to take the next question. So it's about how to balance a career in expedition medicine as well as focusing on specialty training. It is hard. It is really hard. But I think there are things that are to bear in mind. So expedition medicine is really the thing that excites me most about working in medicine. So I do try and make it a priority. So a lot of it is dependent on who your educational supervisor is. You may be able, if you're in in a hospital where your educational supervisor is someone who is interested in expedition medicine, you may be able to justify some of your study leave for trips. Often it's not going to be a huge amount, but you may be lucky. A lot of it will be doing these trips in your annual leave, which again can be a bit of a challenge and it isn't ideal, but that is the reality really of what it is. That's why taking time out of training is such a good opportunity to get the majority of your expedition opportunities done. And then beyond that, it's really, the realistic thing is really that you're just going to be able to add a handful of trips, maybe 2 or 3 trips a year. But it is a real challenge, definitely. But there's a lot of specialties now that are doing less than full-time training. So, and often you don't need a reason to why you're doing that. So for example, anesthetics allows you now to do 80% or 60% of training without a reason. It is only a short 4-month trial, but it does mean that you have more opportunity to do some expedition trips.
I'd also say don't be afraid to take time out of training, like Kirsty said in her talk. I think there's often, and I certainly suffered from this before coming here, and then also seeing people moving on, like a lot of friends who are now doing training and stuff. There's a kind of fear of missing out or a worry, and often there's this kind of pressure to like press on with training. You're expected to show commitment, and I don't know what you think about this, Kirsty, but it's basically just not true. If you take time out, that you're going to be disadvantaged. If you get good and interesting experience, like, it's well worth it, and no one can really punish you for it. A lot of the applications now are points based anyway, and you can't lose points, so it's just objectively not true. And some of the best clinicians I've ever met, there's one I can think of in particular, has never done a specialty training, and he's like one of the best doctors I've ever met in my life. So you don't have to follow the standard path. It's hard not to get worried about it, and it's an understandable worry to have, but there are other ways.
I'd just like to take a moment to quickly ask everyone to fill out the feedback form, just as a thank you for the presenters. And also we will be emailing around certificates to everyone that puts their details in and supplies an email. So the next question is about how everyone in expedition medicine appears to have some sort of background in emergency medicine. So is it really a necessity, or can experience in other fields such as infectious diseases also be a viable route into expedition medicine?
Absolutely. I think anything is a viable route into expedition medicine. What I would say is, so obviously infectious diseases will stand you in good stead for some of the things that you may see. But the more common things that you see are things that you will have managed in an emergency department or general practice. So as much as it's not a necessity, I think it's a really good thing to have under your belt, even if it's just a 4-month rotation. A lot of companies that I've worked for have asked whether you have experience in GP or emergency medicine. So I think they would look more kindly on your application if you did have that, and maybe pick someone who had GP and emergency medicine experience over someone else who didn't. But it's certainly not a necessity. There are all sorts of people doing expedition medicine. One of my medical directors for a company that I worked for was a dermatologist, and I'm not quite sure what her background was, but she was a consultant dermatologist. And so really it's just having an interest in it, and some outdoor experience is the main thing, really.
So there's also University of Sheffield asking for some contact details, which I'll be happy to pass on. But they've also got a question asking if there's something that they should be doing to guide medical students to start doing the right things early in their med school journey, I imagine, to get into expedition medicine.
So, Kirsty, I'm sure you'll have an opinion on this as well. What I would say is that, to my mind, getting the skills, and by that I mean sort of, competency in being in the mountains, or whatever it is that whatever that kind of extreme thing might be, is probably more important, because the medicine will come. Like, you will get medical experience and you will learn how to be a doctor, but it's often harder to then find the time to, like, say, do a mountain leader course, or learn to ice climb, or learn to sail, these sorts of things. So if that's the sort of thing you have interest in, then university, when you have relatively more free time, is probably the time to do that, and focus less on all this like expedition specific stuff, because that can come with time. What do you think, Kirsty? Anything else?
No, totally agree. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And have fun. Like, go to the mountains, sail, cycle, whatever it is you do, like, have fun.
Yeah.
So I'm sure a lot of other people are also able to relate to this question that's coming up next. So essentially, due to COVID, loads of people didn't get a chance to do their elective, and they were wondering how they can gain more experience in this field, because obviously loads of people missed their chances due to the pandemic last year.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so gutted for you all that you didn't get to do that, but you haven't missed your opportunity. There are so many other opportunities that will come if you give yourself the space to be able to accept trips. So the things that I would say, so you won't be lacking experience. People start to go into expedition medicine at any stage in their medical career, so you're definitely not too late or missing out on any experience. I would say that doing the training courses would be a really good start, and also taking time out of training. So get your foundation years done, and then think about looking for a clinical fellow job like the one that I did, or taking the opportunity that Tom has done to to do a more extended period of time away. It doesn't really matter when you start your experience. It's all, there's no rush to do it. So yeah, just try and give yourself the space. Once you're in specialty training, like I said, it's really hard to get any extended period of time out. So so take a break after foundation. That would be my advice.
Thank you. So the next question, I think you've already slightly touched on this, is other than emergency GP and anesthetics, are there other specialties that will also allow you to do some expedition on the side?
So any specialty will. It's like I said, it's about finding if you make it a priority, you may have to do it in your annual leave, or you may have to add your annual leave and some study leave together to be able to find enough time to do it. But there aren't any specialties that mean that you won't be able to go into expedition medicine. It's like Tom said, it's about having all the other skills outside of medicine and the experience outside of medicine that are the most likely ways to get you those jobs.
So there's another question for Tom, asking, how did you get your job in the UN? Did you feel adequately prepared as an FY3? And this question is from an FY2.
Sure. So that's a good question, actually. So my kind of supervisor who I've got here, I had never met him in person before coming here. He is an infectious diseases doctor from Scotland. and I was about 5 people removed from anyone that sort of knew him directly. So I kind of got it just by asking people. So when the opportunity to come here came up, which is partly because my partner got the job here, I started asking people I knew at work, like, has anyone got any experience? And you'd be surprised how diverse people's experiences have been. And I met a few people who'd actually been to Malawi or knew people who'd been here. And then they put me in touch with people who put me in touch with people. And then eventually I just got in touch with this guy, and he was like, yeah, sure, I'm sure we'll be able to do something. And it's actually, so I'm not kind of, there is something called UN Volunteers, which is this official organization that is sort of a misnomer, really, because they get paid to do that. But mine is a bit more unofficial. And it's mainly because this guy has been like running the treatment center by himself and a clinic for the UN, and was kind of looking for help. And, you know, it's a bit random, really, but yeah, I think asking around is the way to try and do it. You'd be surprised what opportunities are out there. In terms of feeling prepared, I did think about it a lot before coming here, and I have met people who, before doing something like this, specifically made a point of waiting until they were a consultant because they wanted to feel fully trained up. But I think if you can find a place where you're going to feel suitably supported, and I do here, then yes, being an FY3 is okay. I think that's fine. And, you know, sometimes it's also being comfortable saying no to things if you're not, you know, comfortable with it. I haven't done any specific clinical work here yet, which I'm both dreading and looking forward to. But hopefully that's going to be starting in the next couple of weeks whilst the last bits of paperwork get sorted out with the medical council. But again, you're in an environment there where, you know, it's going to be different than in the UK, but there are consultants, there are other doctors around. So, you know, it's about having a bit of perspective and recognizing, and it sounds like you already do, what your skills are as an FY3, and not just going, oh, hey, you know, I can just go run this remote health clinic by myself. Like, this will be fine. You know, you have to have a little bit of insight into where your skill set is. Hopefully that kind of answers the question.
I think it did. Thank you. So we've gone over, but are you guys still happy to carry on answering the last couple of questions?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, very happy.
Amazing. Okay, so the next question is, obviously, in all the different environments you've worked, there's obviously going to be a lot of different activities that you're going to have to be doing, and different techniques such as climbing, skiing, hiking, or other sport activities. So how do you prepare yourself to be comfortable in these kinds of environments?
So again, it's just about exposure to the outdoors. So getting out. So if you have an interest in those things, that's great, because you'll be out and doing them anyway. You'll be out on, you know, climbing trips with your friends and things like that. I didn't have any, I guess, any formal training in anything. I don't have a mountain leader qualification or anything. I don't have any climbing experience. But I have tried to say yes to opportunities to being out in the hills, and just getting comfortable in that environment. Like I said, some of the training courses, the wilderness and the mountain medicine training courses that you go on, you do get to learn some extra skills when you're there. So it's quite a good way, quite a gentle introduction into getting exposure to some of those skills. What I think is really great is at uni, there's a lot of wilderness medical societies now, and they often run evenings where you don't just do stuff like network on wilderness medicine stuff, but you may go, you know, bouldering or rock climbing or skiing on the weekend if you're lucky enough to be up in Scotland. You know, there are lots of ways to get that kind of experience before you go out on any of these trips. There's always going to be trips that you're not experienced enough to do. For example, when I did my Mexico diving trip, I can't dive, but you know, I knew enough about the medicine surrounding diving, and you know, if I'd had enough money with me, I maybe would have thought about you know, taking the opportunity, as I'd been, you know, as I managed to get the whole trip free, maybe I'll be able to spend a little bit of money doing a introductory to diving course. That wasn't the case at the time, but you know, there are so many opportunities on these trips to gain some of those skills, and you don't have to know them all before you go.
And I would say, just, there's no substitute for, like, in your free time as well. If you enjoy doing these things, just, you know, get out in the mountains or go to the sea, whatever it might be, and just spend time there. There's no real substitute for that experience. And as Kirsty said, like, societies at university are a great way to do this. You know, if there's a mountaineering society or something, you'll find people who have experience, and even if it's not a formal training course, who, you know, you might feel comfortable with them taking you out and doing stuff and learning that way. Yeah.
Super. Thanks, both of you. I think the last question is a great one to kind of wrap up on. Is there any site where you can find a good selection of wilderness medicine study courses or resources?
Go on, Tom.
Oh, well, so I mean, we are
Are
a
you
bit
wearing a
biased.
t-shirt?
I am wearing the t-shirt, yeah.
There you go.
So Adventure Medic, this is a bit biased, but Adventure Medic, we do advertise courses on there. And again, there is a selection of resources that you can find if you go onto the resources page. It's all free, it's all open access. So that's probably, I mean, we're biased, but that is a pretty good resource. I don't know, I'm trying to think if there are other ones that are good as well. Specific companies that run these courses, like wilderness medicine training, things like that, they advertise all these things themselves as well.
Right. Thank you so much, both of you. That was an amazing talk, and thanks for staying over for the questions as well. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for the opportunity.
No worries. So yeah, so if you guys could all fill out the feedback forms, we'd be really, really appreciative, and keep an eye out for more talks by WPMN coming up in the next few months. Thank you. There's a lot of thanks coming through in the chat for you guys.
Oh, great.
Oh,
Thank
that's
you
nice.
very
I
much.
might just stay and revel in it for a little bit. No, thanks so much. That was great.
I'll stop the recording as well.